Thank you, Potter. Lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming out on a Sunday morning. Julia would approve. And Rebecca, merci, mon ami. Rebecca Alcid with Jacques and Julia helped to found this wonderful program here. I think it was the first in the country of its kind. It's now inspiring others. I hope you all support it. It's an important and fantastic study. So, as Potter mentioned, I wrote Julia's memoir, My Life in France. That was published in 2006, and it inspired half the movie Julia and Julia in 2009. And after the film and several book tours, I went on to other things. I wrote about environmental issues and energy and so on. But there were a few stories from my life in France that had sort of lodged in the back of my brain and raised questions and sort of tugged at my imagination. So a decade after that book, I circled back to Julia and started to poke around in the archives and see if I could answer a few questions. My life in France essentially ends in the early 60s when Julia and Paul retire from the diplomatic service and settle here in Cambridge and start their American life. And eventually Julia gets on television and has her career here. And I was intrigued by that because I had sort of left the narrative. I no longer had Julia to ask questions of. She died 2 days shy of her 92nd birthday in August of 2004 when we were halfway through writing her memoir. So it took me another year after her death to finish the book. It was written in Julia's voice in the first person, and I had to take the interviews I'd done with her, with things that she had written, some of Paul's letters, and I had the great benefit of working with Julia's original editor, Judith Jones, to kind of keep it all in that very idiosyncratic Julia voice. And it was an act of ventriloquism in a way, and it was really fun. As I said, I moved on, but I had these questions. I was wondering about when they moved back here, what was their life like? How did Julia get onto television? What were the books that she was writing? Whatever happened to the documentary films that she shot in France in 1970, which she referred to as the French chef in France. So as I said, I began to poke around and I found a whole trove at the Schlesinger Library, which is at Radcliffe, where Julia gave her papers and all of Paul's photographs. And I found, amongst other things, I found letters and scripts and old promotional brochures, photographs, film footage, and I discovered they were full of stories about the Childs here in America that I either never knew or I'd completely forgotten about. And a lot of them were really inspiring. Some of them were funny, others were sad, and this being Julia, some of them were just simply amazing. And I came to understand that the 1970s was a crucial decade for Julia. It was the point when she launched into a dynamic new phase of her career and her life, when, as she said, she burst out of the straitjacket of classical French cuisine and performing as the French chef. She began to use recipes from around the world. She began to write in the first person, which did not come easily for her. She told personal stories from her childhood and her life. And she left behind the French chef persona and reinvented herself as Julia Child. So I don't think anyone else has really focused on this, and it took me a while to kind of see this picture emerge of Julia's transformation. And I now think of it as Julia's second act. And it's just as inspiring as the years in France, which we wrote about in her memoir. So it sort of felt like I had uncovered a hidden history of Julia. And so I set out to show how she overcame a series of personal and professional challenges and finally discovered her true voice. Now, the child's move to Boston was an important part of Julia's transformation. So I thought I would read to you a little section about that. And since this is the home team, I hope you appreciate this. This is a section from Chapter 2. It's called 103 Irving Street. In January 1959, the Childs were living in a small house on Olive Avenue in Washington, D.C. Paul had been temporarily named the chief of exhibits for the USIA, the U.S. Information Agency, and Julia was fine-tuning the manuscript for what would become Mastering the Art of French Cooking. To all outward appearances, they were happily committed to a career in diplomacy. But behind closed doors, they had made a momentous decision. After one more posting to Oslo, Norway, Paul would retire, and the Childs would return to civilian life in America. He had just turned 57, and she would soon turn 47. They had enjoyed their time abroad, most of all in France, and were ready to settle down. They had a quiet life already planned. Julia would cook, write, and teach classes. Paul would paint, write, and take photographs. They would find a nice house, surround themselves with good friends and sophisticated culture, and enjoy delicious wine and food. After much consideration, they chose Cambridge, Massachusetts over other cities, such as Washington, D.C., which they liked but didn't love, Los Angeles, Julia's hometown, though too far from family and friends, and New York, too much hustle and bustle. Paul had spent much of his youth in Boston and had lived in Cambridge with his first great love, Edith Kennedy, in 1930 when he taught at the Shady Hill School. Paul had friends in Cambridge and felt comfortable in its leafy, left-leaning academic milieu, as did Julia. Though raised in Pasadena, California, her family was rooted in Massachusetts, and she often mentioned her New England Yankee lineage. She graduated from Smith College in Northampton and had grown fond of Cambridge during visits. Cambridge was a charming town, intimate enough to provide a genuine community, but just across the Charles River from the city of Boston. Best of all, to Julia's eye, Cambridge was populated by eggheads, intellectuals from widely varied backgrounds, some of whom taught at Harvard, MIT, and Boston University, others who were architects, historians, economists, or restaurateurs. The Childs had taken several scouting trips to Cambridge, but had yet to find a house that felt like home. Then, in January 1959, Avis Devoto called to say, "I've heard about a special house. It's not on the market yet, but it will be soon. It's perfect for you. Drop everything and come up here immediately." In Cambridge, the Childs made their way to 103 Irving Street on a leafy lane behind the Harvard campus. The house was a wide, 3-story tall, gray, clapboard Victorian, built in 1889 by the philosopher Hosea Royce. It had a short driveway, a modest garden, a full basement, and a long kitchen, 18 feet wide by 24 feet long. The big gray house needed refurbishment, but Avis was right. There was something special about it. It spoke to us, Julia recalled. As a third couple toured 103 Irving, the Childs figured they'd never find anything better and made a generous offer, about $48,000, on the spot. Their bid was accepted. Hooray, they cheered. Then they rented the house out and decamped for Norway for exactly 2 years and 2 days. On May 19, 1961, Paul Child quit his job after 16 years in the Foreign Service. "Ah, freedom at last. No more of this hurly-burly, thank you very much," he and Julia said to each other. Upon returning to the States, the Childs moved into 103 Irving Street and set to making it their own. It was their first permanent home together. Upon entering 103 Irving Street, you had the sensation you were stepping into Paul and Julia's conjoined brains. It was the decoration that gave that impression. The front hallway held one of Paul's hand-carved wooden chests, while nearly every wall was decorated by his etchings, photographs, and paintings. wartime charts of Japanese aircraft, cubistic Parisian rooftops, red tobacco barns, watery reflections of Venice, portraits of Julia, and the like. When Edith Ephron of TV Guide visited in 1970, she was stunned by the house, which appeared to be a complex 19th century artwork. "Why has no one written about you?" she asked Paul. An attractive gentleman who is actually 68, looks to be about 55, and assures us that he feels like 40. He smiled and quietly replied, "They don't see me, they only see Julia." But, Ephron noted, the joke is on them. If you don't see Paul, you don't see Julia either. This beautiful world that Paul Child has created is the world that Julia lives in. And the pale assistant/husband, whose paintings are eagerly bought by the Boston University population, is the creative lord of it. Good going, BU. Inevitably, Geffs would end up in the kitchen, which Julia described as the beating heart and social center of the house. It was certainly the most loved and most used room, she said. Friends felt free to knock on the door at 103 Irving, and when they did, Julia would usher them into the kitchen to chop cold butter into cubes, baste the goose, or haul wine up from the basement. She writes, "They walk about, then sit at the table, and we have aperitifs and talk while I am finishing the dinner. It's easy and pleasant, and I am one of the party the way I like to be. Food is better too, infinitely better, because the cook is in the kitchen the way a chef is in his restaurant. No fresh green beans to sit to warm up, losing their texture and color, while I am in the dining room. No sauce will boil away, nor custard curdle. Furthermore, nobody minds a bit of public stirring, tossing, and tasting. After eating, I pile the plates in my double sink and hide them under big stainless trays, while all finished pots are covered discreetly and the stove light doused. Everything looks shipshape, in other words. Then out we go to have coffee in the clean and well-ordered living room. That is my idea of a proper kitchen." After moving into 103 Irving Street in 1961, Julia met Dorothy Zinberg, a graduate student in sociology at Harvard at Legal Seafoods. Looking over their haddock, lobsters, and clams, chatting with the store's owner, George Berkowitz, the two conversed as any other housewives might, except that Julia Child happened to be unusually inquisitive and well-informed about food. The post-war culinary revolution was just getting underway in New York. French classics like coq au vin and boeuf bourguignon gave way to the gourmet trend of Spanish paella, Peruvian ceviche, Indonesian pork sauté, and Arabian chicken roasted with cloves and honey. But Cambridge was essentially a provincial New England town, Zinberg recalled, like living in the country. While Boston had some fine establishments, Cambridge restaurants tended to serve meat and potatoes basics or red sauce Italian food. This was an era when dinner party menus consisted of grilled spam, pineapple chunks, and gelatin mold salad stuffed with marshmallows, Zinberg said with a shudder. Yikes. The Childs had a remarkable set of neighbors, most of whom lived within a few blocks of one another. The economist and former ambassador to India, John Kenneth Galbraith, and his wife Kitty lived behind Paul and Julia. Avis and Bernard DeVoto lived close by, as did Dorothy and her husband Norman Zinberg, who was an influential psychoanalyst at Harvard. Not far away were historian Arthur Schlesinger Sr., Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and his wife, the author Marion Schlesinger. Some friends became professional collaborators who influenced Paul and Julia as much as the Childs influenced them. Ben and Jane Thompson, for instance, ran the influential home furnishing store Design Research in Cambridge, which would later supply cookware and Marimekko prints for the French chef set. In the early 70s, the Thompsons opened Harvest, a modern American restaurant on Harvard Square that opened in the same spirit as Alice Waters' Chez Panisse in Berkeley, and trained many of Boston's leading chefs. And in 1976, the Thompsons and the developer James Rouse, with the Child's vocal support, renovated Boston's decrepit Faneuil Hall into a festival marketplace inspired by Les Halles in Paris. In Cambridge, there was a vast core of overeducated and underemployed women who were ready for Julia, said Zinberg. We didn't know who she was at first, but then she changed our lives in every way you can imagine. So that's a bit for you guys, the home team. There's a lot more in there about Julia's house and how they designed the kitchen together, and her life in Cambridge and Boston. Now, many people assume that Julia was the first cook on television, but that was actually far from the truth. There were shows starting in the 1940s when people were cooking. In fact, James Beard had a show on in 1946 called I Love to Eat, which was an apt title. He was a large man, jolly man. And in the 50s, we had dozens of local shows all across the country with things like Mary Wilson's Pots, Pans, and Personalities, Marjorie Hume's What's Cookin', the opera-singing Italian chef Pino Bontempi, and my favorite, the blind Mexican cook Elena Zalieta, who would sort of do all the talking while her son Billy ran around and did the cooking. At that period of time, the Childs didn't even own a television set and had only seen, I think, 1 or 2 shows. They were still abroad. But they retired from the diplomatic service in 1961 and settled into this large clapboard house here in Cambridge. That October, Knopf published Mastering the Art of French Cooking. And in the following year, in the spring of '62, Julia appeared on a local program called What I've Been Reading on WGBH, which was then Boston's fledgling PBS station. Her appearance on that show, I should say actually that Julia showed up at What I've Been Reading with her book, but also with a hot plate and a pan, lots of butter, and some eggs, and proceeded to make an omelet in the French way. And she was so intent on making that omelet that she forgot to mention the title of her book. But it didn't matter because the station received something like 27 letters from people saying, we want more of that tall lady cooking. And I think the station honchos looked at each other and thought, cooking show, tall lady, okay, maybe we should give this a shot. So encouraged, she shot 3 pilots or test shows. And the second one was on coq au vin, the chicken stew. And after that, a viewer named Irene McHogue wrote a fairly amazing letter. She says, Irene McHogue wrote, not only did I get a wonderfully refreshing new approach to the preparation and cooking of said poultry, but really and truly one of the most surprisingly entertaining half hours I have ever spent before the TV in many a moon. I loved the way she projected over the camera directly to me, the watcher. Loved watching her catch the frying pan as it almost went off the counter. Loved her looking for the cover of the casserole. It was fascinating to watch her hand motions, which were so firm and sure with the food. And her to-do about the brandy firing was without parallel for that rare tongue-in-cheek sort of humor the viewer longs for in this day of the over-rehearsed ad-lib. Not bad for the second time that Julia was ever on television. And having done some TV myself, I can tell you it's a difficult medium. It's not natural for everybody. Those pilots were a big enough success that in 1963, Julia began The French Chef on public television. And almost immediately, she grabbed the public's attention with her deft knife skills, her encouraging demeanor, her idiosyncratic voice, and her giddy humor. She made you feel as if you were in the kitchen with her, as she grumbled that potatoes are neurotic vegetables, cursed under her breath and then laughed at herself when she burnt her finger, or leaned down to brush the teeth of a roast suckling pig. There was simply no one else doing that on television, even today. And Julia explained the method to her madness this way. She said, The idea was to take the bugaboo out of French cooking, to demonstrate that it's not merely good cooking, but that it follows definite rules. Julia loved rules, and she loved to break rules. One of the secrets of cooking is to learn to correct something if you can, and bear with it if you cannot. The audience responded viscerally. "You are a delight," wrote housewives, hippies, taxi drivers, MIT scientists, and Wall Street bankers. The French chef was educational TV's answer to underground movie and pop-op cults, wrote Joan Bartel in the New York Times Magazine. The program can be campier than Batman, further out than Lost in Space, and more penetrating than Meet the Press, as it probes the question, can a society be great if its bread tastes like Kleenex? There was something intimate and subverbal, even primal, about the experience of watching Julia cook. Her food was so lovingly portrayed that there are moments, even now, when it transports you. Julia liked to point the TV camera straight down into a pot of softly bubbling boeuf bourguignon to show you what it should look like as it cooked. It was instructive, but it also activated your taste buds and it tempted you to dive right through the screen to dig into a heaping bowl of that succulent comfort food. "To do that is not easy," observed the chef Jacques Pepin. "She had a very rare quality." An important, if little remarked upon, aspect of the French chef was the implied narrative of each episode. From Julia's often humorous opening, "Julia Child presents the Chicken Sisters," through the instruction to the triumphal digestion of a meal. While TV chefs like James Beard and Dion Lucas would end their shows by holding up their handiwork for the camera's clinical inspection, Julia would proudly march a pot of ratatouille from the kitchen into the dining room set, bearing the finished dish like rubies on velvet, Bartel noted. Place it on a table decorated with actual candles and silverware, pour a glass of wine, serve herself a plateful of the vegetable mélange, and dig in with palpable hunger. This seemingly logical coda to a cooking show was an innovation. It completed the journey of the meal from conception to creation to consumption. "Julia was a revolutionary," said her editor, Judith Jones. "The first time I saw her on TV, I just knew. She's got it." People ask, "Well, how can you be so sure?" Well, you just know. When you're passionate about something and it arouses something in you, it's just instinctual. It was like having a teacher right there beside you in the kitchen, and everything really worked. So in 1970, Julia and her French friend, Simca Beck, finished writing Mastering the Art of French Cooking, Volume 2. To make it stand apart from Volume 1, they tackled ambitious new recipes like how to bake baguettes in your home kitchen, grind up a foie gras sausage, or construct elegant Napoleons in your American home. Julia and Simca were quite a team. They were both tall, strong-willed, had trained at the Cordon Bleu, married suave older men, had no children, drove like outlaws, and held strong opinions. They called each other sister, and they loved each other and frequently fought like blood relatives. And Julia was a classic American. She liked to explain every recipe in a very logical way. She wanted to know all the hows and whys of a dish, and she liked to provide exact measurements. Remember, Julia began cooking in her late 30s, and so she was really writing for someone like herself who was perhaps a little bit intimidated at first and wanted to know exactly how to make things. Simca, meanwhile, was a quintessential French woman. She was an intuitive cook with an amazing sense of taste and a lifetime's worth of training, but Simca could be volatile and demanding. She would often create a fabulous recipe in her Parisian kitchen, try it once, kind of fudge the measurements, type it up and send it to Julia in Cambridge, who would then try it 8 or 10 times, trying to get it to work in the American kitchen with American ingredients and American measurements. And she'd make copious notes and send it back to Simca. And so there was this constant flow back and forth across the Atlantic of airmail paper, which is now all at the Schlesinger Library, which is really fun to read. Not infrequently, Simca would later claim that the recipe she had suggested was all wrong. She'd say, no, 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 we French would never do it like that, even though she had written it herself. Julia was very patient with this at first because she loved Simca, she respected her as a wonderful cook, but they kept missing their deadlines. And Judith Jones, their editor, reduced the book from a planned 14 chapters down to, I think it was 12 chapters, and then down to 9 chapters. And as the deadline loomed, Julia stopped reading Simca's letters out of self-defense because they were running out of time and she simply had to get the work done. As the pressure increased and the tension grew, Julia howled that between stove and typewriter, I don't even have time to pee. But she managed to hand in the manuscript at the 11th hour in March of 1970. It may not be the book of your dreams, ma chérie, she consoled Simca, but it will be done. The book was done, but so was their collaboration, though they remained friends for the rest of their life. Simca had grown increasingly resentful of Julia's multimedia celebrity here in America. It was a phenomenon that, as a French woman, a proud French woman, she didn't really understand. She didn't get it that when Julia won an Emmy Award or was on the cover of Time magazine, was on television every week, she didn't understand how important that was. Simca considered herself the better cook, and she assumed that her relationship with Julia was as it had been when they wrote the first volume of Mastering the Art. But in the meantime, Julia was growing tired of Simca's tirades and capriciousness, and more importantly, I think, she was evolving in a more American direction. After all, she was living here, and I think she was starting to chafe at some of the constrictions of doing just classical French cuisine. And so I suspect that their professional parting of the ways would have happened inevitably, but I think all that fractiousness over Volume 2 kind of drove them apart. By 1971, Mastering Volume 2 was selling well, yet the public reaction to Season 2 of The French Chef was muted. And Julia was perplexed by this. She had put so much work into that second series of The French Chef. It was shot in color for the first time. There were more episodes than ever. She included this series of short documentaries that she had shot in France, and yet people didn't really seem to notice. And she seemed to confront a previously unthinkable possibility, that the culture was shifting beneath her feet, and America's infatuation with French cooking and the French chef was becoming passé, in part because of forces that she herself had unleashed. In public, Julia remained a star, but in private, she worried that the response to Season 2 was a harbinger of professional mortality. And you see her working this out for herself on the page. It's really interesting. She wrote to her producer, Ruthie Lockwood, she said, "Perhaps we aren't quite getting across. So why? This we must try and find out, because if we don't do better, there won't be another year. Are we trying to be too technical or booky? Are we losing the fun because we are too picky? Are we too complicated and talky? Or are we just getting out of step?" And then in parentheses, she writes, "I will not do macrobiotics and vegetarianism, however." And then she wrote a similar letter to her editor, Judith Jones, and she concludes by saying, "The unifying force is the same old cook in the same old kitchen. That is perhaps why we have aroused no more interest in spite of color and French inserts, essentially the same, so why talk about it? I'm quite aware that there comes a time when one is frankly out of style, out of step, and had better fold up and steal away." But then she seemed to catch herself sounding maudlin and stiffened her spine. "However, I shall certainly hang on with full vigor for the time being." Julia was restless and perhaps unconsciously preparing to shift her career in what Jones called new and different and somewhat experimental directions. So that new direction was that Julia decided to write a new book on her own for the first time. And it was a new kind of book. With Judith Jones's urging, Julia decided to write the book in the first person. This would accomplish two goals. First of all, it would set her apart from her past as the French chef and with Simca and only doing French food. And second of all, it would bring Julia's much loved and often satirized personal voice from television to the screen. And it would give the book a more intimate feel. But there was just one problem, and that was that while Julia was a natural and gifted performer, she was a modest person, and she really didn't like to talk about herself. She would say to Judith, less pictures of me in the book, more pictures of the food. And I can tell you, when I was working on her on her memoir, the hardest challenge I had was to get her to talk about herself. She was always deflecting. I'd say, now Julia, tell me about your little apartment in Paris. Describe it for me. And she'd say, oh, it was a lovely little place. Now how are your children? And I'd have to say, wait a minute, no, this isn't about me and my kids. Tell me about your family. And it just took a long time. And finally, the key that unlocked her was I began to read aloud from the letters that she, and especially Paul, wrote from Paris to my grandparents in Pennsylvania in the 50s. Now, Paul and my grandfather were twin brothers, and Julia and my grandmother were very close, and so they would write back and forth every week. And these letters are remarkable. They're full of all sorts of detail about the weather and the price of wine and what Julia was cooking and what Paul was dealing with during the Cold War at the U.S. Embassy, and it's just very kind of journalistic detail, and so it was fabulous. At any rate, Julia, it took her a while, but she understood that Judith was right, that the first person was a good way to go on this new book. And so slowly she began to put together this voice and in what she called a personal meander. And she built a series of narratives with recipes, each one of which was structured as a cooking class. And for the first time, she broke the fourth wall and really addressed the reader and used humor to impart her instruction. And part of this, one of the most charming aspects of it, was that with her new confidence, Julia began to tell personal stories. And I like this one about one of her earliest food memories. It was 1926 when Julia was 14, the McWilliamses, that's her family, took a family trip from Pasadena to Tijuana, Mexico, just south of the border. It was a place where Americans could drink forbidden beer and cocktails during Prohibition, listen to marimba, and gamble wickedly at the casino. Word had spread to Los Angeles, and soon Hollywood celebrities were driving down to enjoy the good life in Tijuana. One of the allures was Caesar's salad. Caesar Cardini was an Italian immigrant who owned a restaurant in Tijuana. On July 4th, 1924, a crush of tourists depleted his pantry, and Cardini made do with whatever leftovers he could find: romaine lettuce, olive oil, lemon juice, eggs, Worcestershire sauce, croutons, garlic, Parmesan cheese, and black pepper. He carefully composed a salad using only the best leaves, and then, with a flourish, tossed the ingredients together tableside, turning them over and over like a large wave breaking, Julia wrote. When the McWilliams family visited, Caesar himself rolled the big cart up to the table and tossed the romaine in a great wooden bowl, Julia recalled. I can see him break 2 eggs over that romaine and roll them in, the greens going all creamy as eggs flowed over them. He encouraged his guests to pick each romaine leaf up by the stem and eat it with their fingers. What a great idea, enthused Julia. What fun for television. And as a kid, she always encouraged me to eat asparagus with my fingers, which I still try to do when I can get away with it. Um, Despite her growing self-confidence, one of Julia's most endearing traits was her ability to admit her own failures, especially when it came to apple desserts. Every one of them my own fault, she lamented. In the famous Tarte Tatin show, Julia flipped the apple dessert out of its pan, but instead of a beautiful caramelized confection, she produced a puddle of beige mush. Well, that's a little loose, she laughed. It's classic, you should see it. It's on the DVD, and it's really worth seeing. To save the day, she scooped the mess into a pile, sifted powdered sugar over it, and browned it under the broiler, reassuring her viewers, it's okay, because you can show your guests how clever you are by fixing everything up. She noted that mistakes are inevitable. She did not apologize, and she made the best of it. But Julia was a closet perfectionist who hated to appear unprofessional. And here's a little insight to her personality. Years later, when she and I were working on her memoir together, she was still obsessing over that Tarte Tatin. And she was annoyed, and she was muttering conspiratorially that the Cortland apples she used must have been mislabeled. I had to laugh at her. She didn't think it was funny. This new book that she wrote was published in 1975. It was called From Julia Child's Kitchen. And it was a hit, but it had not come easily. In fact, she told me it was the most difficult book she ever wrote. In part because of developing this first-person voice, perhaps more profoundly because of what was happening behind the scenes. First of all, Julia was more of a cook and performer than a writer. She really struggled to get her words down on the page in a way that she liked. She relied on Paul and on Judith Jones for help with that. Second, Paul had undergone a heart bypass operation in 1974, during which the oxygen was starved to his brain, leaving with him much diminished and with what he ruefully called the mental scrambles. It took him months to regain his speech and mobility, and Julia retreated from public view to tend to him. It was one of the most difficult periods of their life together, and she really hardly ever talked about this. But typically, Julia found solace in her work. She was working on this new book, and she drove herself to the point of exhaustion. And she says, well, thank heavens I did. Without a challenging cookbook to work on, I could well have gone cuckoo in those dark months. When the book was published, Julia was thrilled to emerge from the shadows of the sickbay to talk and cook for her public once again. And whether she realized it or not, this was the moment in 1975, when she was 63 years old and the world was in turmoil, that Julia Child embarked on her second act. Now, having found this new voice of hers, she began to use it very loudly and aggressively. She wrote for mass market publications like Parade magazine and McCall's. She disparaged vegetarians and nutritionists, supported agribusiness, and munched McDonald's French fries cooked in beef tallow. She questioned whether Nouvelle Cuisine was really as healthy and revolutionary as its promoters insisted. And though she disliked being labeled a feminist, she inspired many women, was a proud liberal Democrat, and supported Planned Parenthood. These opinions, not surprisingly, brought attention and enemies. And this was something surprising to me. I knew Julia well. I had never seen her say a bad word. She liked to curse once in a while and tell funny jokes, but I didn't realize that she had actual enemies. For example, Madeleine Kamen, a French-born American-based cooking teacher who lived not far from here, derided Julia as neither French nor a chef. And she said, why not me? I am French, I'm a chef. The food writers John and Karen Hess, who often wrote for the New York Times, sneered that Julia was not a cook, but she plays one on TV. Julia was careful to ignore this criticism in public, but in private, she was annoyed, and she said she'd like to grind Kamen, who she called She Who Will Not Be Named, grind her up piece by piece in my food processor. One thing is, Julia wasn't just a nice old lady. She was tough. She had thick skin. She could take a joke, and she could dish it out too. But she was also media savvy, and she knew that to engage in an argument with her critics really wouldn't serve her. And in the meantime, her friends, like the writer Betty Fussell, rose to her defense and criticized these fellow cooks for friendly fire, for going after Julia, who she thought was a real revolutionary and a leader. The other aspect of this is, as Julia's star rose in the media heavens, she was paid perhaps the ultimate American compliment in that she was spoofed on television. First as Julia Grown-Up on The Electric Company, and then most famously by Dan Aykroyd on SNL. And I got to interview him for this new book. He's a lovely guy. He's a real foodie. His aunt, Hélène Gougeron, was known as the Julia Child of Canada. And in fact, when Julia gave Hélène one of the early Cuisinarts, that inspired Dan's crazy Bassomatic 76 skit, which you may be familiar with, in which he liquefies a fish. It's a funny story, and you should read that in the book. And then most famously, or infamously, his bloody, warbling, finger dicing, save the liver impersonation, which he wrote with Al Franken. It's remarkable because that skit aired in 1978. And to this day, it defines Dan Aykroyd, SNL, and to a large degree, Julia Child. The fact that they used it in the movie Julie and Julia, I think, helped to perpetuate that. And I can't tell you how many people come up to me and say, what did Julia think of that skit? Was she offended by it? And I say to them, well, Julia did not appreciate mean-spirited humor, but this she loved. She was really tickled by Dan's impersonation, and unfortunately they never met. He told me he saw it as a real tribute to Julia, sort of an homage, and he says it came from a place of total respect for her. And legend has it that at the end of a long dinner party, Julia might throw her head back and say, "Save the liver." So I think that worked out okay. Beneath the spats and the spoofs, Julia remained focused and productive. In 1978, she created Julia Child and Company, and in 1979, Julia Child and More Company, as TV shows and books simultaneously, with two staffs working side by side, almost nonstop for 2 years straight. It was barely controlled mayhem, but she'd just smile and say, "Isn't this fun?" and serve some wine at lunch. This was a very ambitious project. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. And she really was swinging for the fences. Sadly, the shows never really found their audience. And although she rarely complained about anything, even her mastectomy that she had in 1968, Julia pointed an accusing finger this time. Sensing that public television had forgotten her, or snubbed her, or possibly even sabotaged her, Julia told an interviewer, "We just killed ourselves on the company shows. But PBS, I don't know whether they forgot we taped it or what, but they never got on the air in some places." And this is an interesting moment in her life. Again, she's reached a critical juncture where she feels that she's losing traction and she's hitting some resistance. And as she did many times, she adapted. She says, "It's a 12-hour day and a 7-day week, and I'm not going to go into that kind of thing and have it just lay an egg. That's a damn good book, and they were damn good shows and very original recipes. A lot of places didn't get the company shows because PBS never announced that it was going out there. So I'm through, frankly." In the 17 years she had been at WGBH, Julia had produced 250 television shows that were broadcast on 104 PBS stations, had written or co-written 5 books, and was a major fundraiser for public TV. But after the bungling of the company series, she was disenchanted. So she went and quit PBS and went to Good Morning America, which was a very different beast. It was a big national commercial TV show. She had to shrink her cooking instruction from 30-minute segments down to 3-minute sound bites. And it really was very difficult at first. But again, she was resilient and she was adaptive. And so she got the hang of it and, in classic Julia fashion, found a larger audience than ever. Julia was not the first chef on TV, but I believe that she was the first celebrity chef on TV. And her special sauce, her ability to blend deep knowledge, precise technique, relatability, and unbridled enthusiasm created a new model for what cooks could do and food could be, and got the public talking about eating in a whole new way. I'm often asked what Julia would think of today's 24/7 culinary circus on television, and I think she would have very mixed feelings. On the one hand, I think she would be disappointed by the glitz and the glam, and the faux competitions, the soap opera storylines. She thought of cooking as a civilized art and loved it for its camaraderie and creativity, not for competition. On the other hand, I think she would be thrilled to see how many Americans consider themselves foodies now and are eating with gusto, which is one of her favorite phrases. If you don't eat with gusto, the gastric juices are not going to work properly. So don't eat meekly, she'd say. I'm going to finish up here with a little section from the end of the book, which I think I sort of stumbled over. I think it kind of gets to the essence of Julia. This is a section called Child's Play, and it goes like this. Throughout her career, journalists often like to note how childlike Julia Child could be and how she loved to play with food. And it was true. Her audience laughed when she dropped a potato pancake on the stove, then scooped it back into the pan, saying, "When you're alone in the kitchen, who's to know?" She flirted with David Letterman while blowtorching a raw hamburger, made winking double entendres on Good Morning America, and summoned Jacques Pepin to the stove with a honking duck call. She encouraged this vision of childlike play to a point, but it could be misleading. As Paul knowingly observed, practically every article on Julia has concentrated on the clown instead of the woman, the cook, the expert, or the revolutionary. There was another Julia, one who saw something deeper, more profound and mysterious in our ability to turn raw ingredients into something delicious to eat, and how life-altering that experience could be. I was reminded of this when I happened to glance at a postscript in Julia Child and Company. It was a short, easily overlooked aside titled, "On Playing with Your Food." I read it expecting to laugh, yet something about it, the tone, the celebration of cooking as art, the encouragement and inclusiveness of its message, caught my attention. So I read it again, and then again, and I realized that Julia's lighthearted title masked a heartfelt cri de coeur, one that makes a fitting epitaph. Julia wrote, "Some children like to make castles out of their rice pudding or faces with raisins for eyes. It's forbidden so sternly that when they grow up, they take a horrid revenge by dyeing meringues pale blue or baking birthday cakes in the form of horseshoes or lyres or whatnot. That's not playing with food, that is trifling. Play to me means freedom and delight, as in the phrase, play of imagination. If cooks did not enjoy speculating about new possibilities in every method and each raw material, their art would stagnate and they would become rote performers, not creators. True cooks love to set one flavor against another in the imagination, to experiment with the great wealth of fresh produce in the supermarkets, to bake what previously they braised, to try new devices. We all have flops, of course, but we learn from them, and when an invention or variation works out at last, it is an enormous pleasure to propose it to our fellows. Let's all play with our food, I say, and in so doing, let us advance the state of the art together." Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions or even hear a Julia story or two. Okay, so the question is about my process in writing this book. Um, and for me, it was an evolution. Because I grew up with Julia, I had a lot of experience and I had her voice in the back of my mind. And then I was very fortunate to work with her in the last few months of her life in 2004 on her memoir, which was the first time I dove into the archive and I saw those wonderful letters. In fact, there's a funny story. Julia had been talking about doing that memoir since 1969, and it had never appeared. And she would refer to it as the France book, and she would always, mention, "Oh, I'm working on the France book," and it would never appear. And so I grew up, and I ended up having my own career as a writer, and I offered to help her with the France book, but she politely declined. She said, "Not now, dearie." But finally, she was 91 years old, and I made my annual visit to her, where she had retired in Santa Barbara. And I said, how's the France book coming, Julia? And she said, "Well, it's not so great now." And I said, "Well, I'm here to help." And she said, "Okay, let's do it." And so I said, "Well, show me what you've got. I know you've been working on this for a long time." So she pulled open the drawer of her desk. And instead of manuscript pages, which is what I was expecting, what I found were neatly organized manila envelopes filled with airmail paper. And these were many of the letters that she and Paul had written to my grandparents from France in the late 40s and early 50s. And they were perfectly preserved, as if they'd been written yesterday. Julia's tended to be typewritten with lots of crossing outs and exclamation points and capital letters. They were only about a page or a page and a half. Paul's were handwritten in a beautiful flowing script. They would go on for 5, 6, 7 pages. He would often do little illustrations or paste photographs in. And the combination of these things was just remarkable. And as I mentioned, I was able to unlock Julia's memories by reading aloud from the letters. And if anybody has an older relative with great stories to tell, this is a wonderful technique that I've kind of stumbled over. By reading aloud those letters, it brought Julia back into that moment to the point where she almost began to relive it. She began to talk about, I would read her a section of Paul's letters, for example, about the day they went up to Sacré-Cœur and they had a meal at a little bistro, and she said, "Oh yes," and she'd start to talk in the present tense as if she was doing it. And she'd say, "Oh yes, we are walking up the hill to Sacré-Cœur, and oh, there's a little bistro on the left, and I see a doggy with a green sweater on," and she'd be off with the story. And so once I got her flowing like that, then the memories began to bubble up, and she was able to talk about Paul and her relationship with him, and by the way, about herself. And then she sort of became less self-conscious and just started to tell stories. So it was a fun experience. So that book, the memoir, was Julia's. It was written in her voice in the first person. This book is a very different beast. It's 10 years on. It's written in my voice in the third person. And I did a fair amount of reporting around my subject because she wasn't here to talk to. And as a journalist, that's sort of my instinct. And so I talked to, for example, her director, Russ Morash. I talked to her friends who, like Dorothy Zinberg, who I mentioned earlier, who were neighbors. I talked to friends, family members, academics. And then I went into the Schlesinger archives, saw what was there. I was able to spend some time at WGBH, which was really fun. Saw some footage. In fact, I mentioned these French Chef in France documentaries that they shot in 1970, which had really captured my imagination. And when I first started this book, I called GBH up and I said, "Do you know whatever happened to those wonderful short documentary films?" And what they showed was things like Julia in the fish market at Marseille, the fishermen coming in at dawn with their catch, the screaming fishwives, as she called them, yelling at each other and selling the fish. The Poilin bakery in Paris, where there was a kind of a dungeon-like oven in the basement. The hand making of candied fruit and so on. These things that were her original inspiration. And I just thought they were fabulous, and I thought maybe I would do an article about those films or perhaps even a short documentary. But as far as I knew, they had disappeared. So I called GBH and said, "Do you know what's happened to those?" And there was this silence on the end of the phone, and the researcher, Keith, said, "It's amazing you just called. We happened to be cleaning out some back stairs, and we found these old rusted canisters of film, and we were going to throw them out. But we figured we better take a look first and see what they were." And it turns out it was the French chef in France. And there was one machine left in the building that was able to play the films. And he said, "You can come see them if you want." I said, "Great." Came up here and I saw them, and they're fabulous. It's like a time capsule, all shot in that super saturated color. And then I was able to, through GBH, see some things that the public has forgotten or never knew about, such as the documentary that Julia shot in 1967 at the White House. It was the first time that TV cameras were allowed into the White House kitchen, which is probably something you could not get away with today. It was a black and white documentary. Julia's wearing a little flip curl wig because she was doing multi-day shoots, and it was just easier to throw the wig on. She's got a kind of a chic jacket on, and she documents a state dinner for the Prime Minister of Japan at the White House. This is 1967. LBJ is the president. It's the height of the Vietnam War. There's racial strife all across the country. It's a very difficult time. He's kind of withdrawn from public view. And somehow, Julia being Julia, she managed to cajole LBJ and get into the White House and make this remarkable documentary. My favorite part of this is that the entertainer at the end of the evening was Tony Bennett. And he got so excited that he ripped off his tie and threw off his jacket. And Julia says, "Whoa, Tony Bennett has sung himself right out of his jacket." And then the president and the prime minister are coming over to congratulate him, and he's trying to get it back on. And then I discovered that she did a second show at the White House in 1976, 9 years later, when Gerald Ford was president. And in 76, of course, was the bicentennial. And he had invited Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip to come and celebrate. And it was a highly organized, very fancy white tie event. They had built a beautiful white tent out on the lawn of the White House. And about 5 minutes before the show was to begin, before the event was to begin, a terrible rainstorm hit Washington, and it flooded out the tent. It knocked out all the TV cameras. It soaked Julia. She had to run back to the hotel and change. They managed to get 1 or 2 cameras going again and get the sound equipment. She wasn't very impressed by many celebrities, but she was enamored of the Queen and the handsome Prince Philip. And so it worked out well. The second sort of down note was Ford had chosen as an entertainer the Captain and Tennille. And they were singing their hits such as Muskrat Love, which Julia didn't think was very queenly. So thanks to GBH, I was able to see the 67 documentary. I saw a show that nobody knows about that she shot with Jim Beard called 13 Feasts for 13 Colonies, which was about colonial cooking. I hope they make those things public at some point. Anyway, it was a really fun book to write, and there's a lot of information out there, and so I would suggest just keep going. I'm sure you'll find stuff that I didn't have time to find. And it was fun to write about Julia in a more kind of journalistic way and kind of give her more 3 dimensions rather than just through her voice. So the question is about James Beard, who was known as the Dean of American Cookery. I mentioned him earlier. He had one of the first cooking shows on in 1946. Julia called him a large, round presence, I think. He was a wonderful guy, and they were very close friends. They first met in 1961 in New York when Julia and Simca ran a self-financed book tour, because back then you didn't do book tours. And Judith Jones called Beard up, cold called him, and asked him to come and host a party for Julia, which he did. And at the party, all 12 people who were part of the food world then attended, including a young chef just off the boat from France named Jacques Pepin. And Beard, at the end of the night, said, "I only wish I had written that book myself," which was very high praise indeed. And they became fast friends, Julia and Jim. they used to call each other the bearded child, or in French, l'enfant barbu. And they did many cooking demonstrations together. He used to run a little cooking school. They would do things large and small, and they got along famously. In 1975, Julia, who considered herself a history nut, decided to return to her roots and write about colonial food. Her family, the McWilliamses, had a classic American story. They had come over to the early Massachusetts colony, had made a small fortune in the paper business in the Berkshires, had moved to the Midwest, then to follow the gold rush to the Bay Area, and then settled in Pasadena, where they were wealthy landowners. And so they had this kind of classic trajectory. And she, as I mentioned earlier, she went to Smith. Her mother was raised in the Berkshires. She loved to talk about her Yankee roots. And so this project, this 13 Feasts for 13 Colonies, was a perfect event for her. So she did lots of research, as did Jim, and then they shot a pilot show, which they did at the Wayside Inn in Sudbury. And they open with a table that's just laden with American foods. You know, lobsters and clams and cod and wild turkey and cranberries and corn and these things that the early colonists had adapted their old world recipes and utensils to with these new world ingredients to produce a kind of distinctly American cuisine. This pilot was shot in I think a day or two, and it was a kind of a bizarre combination because Jim, who had trained as an opera singer, had his early TV show, just was not very comfortable on television. He would sit there and stare down at his food silently for long moments, which on television is death. Julia, meanwhile, was kind of hyper that day. She had this frizzy hairdo, she had a purple shirt on, she was constantly talking over him and under him and making double entendres about the big-breasted turkeys. And at one point she gets him grinding corn in an old corn grinder, and she says, well, let's see what happens if you take the little spill shield off. He looks at her and, okay, and takes it off, and of course corn goes flying everywhere, all over the kitchen, and she laughs and laughs, and Jim looks at her like she's insane. So the pilot was made, it was never aired, and that show and book died a quiet death. And at the time, Julia explained it by saying, well, you know, Paul's health is bad and I must tend to him, and GBH doesn't have enough money to really do the production that we want to do. But in my reporting, I think I've learned that perhaps the main reason was that Jim was just not very good at television. And it's hard, I gotta say, it's hard. I think that to protect him, who she really respected, Julia let it kind of fade away, which is a great loss, because you can only imagine Julia and Jim doing colonial food. But I think having seen that pilot, it may have been the right move. It was warm. No, that's a flip answer. The question is, why did Julia retire to Santa Barbara? Well, Julia was raised in Pasadena, and as a child, she used to go up to Santa Barbara for weekends and vacations, as did many of her schoolmates. And she loved Santa Barbara, and it looks a lot like Provence there. It's kind of dry, it's coastal, there are mountains behind it, it's lovely, the food there is amazing. In about 2001, she decided to give her house to her alma mater, Smith College, to do with it as they wished. And the agreement was that they would probably sell it and use the money to fund whatever they needed to do. And the Smithsonian caught wind of this and thought it would be a good idea to take Julia's kitchen and put it on display temporarily down at the National Museum of American History there. And Julia, being modest, said, well, why would they want my kitchen? Everybody but she understood why. And there's a remarkable video that the curators made. It was September 11th, 2001. They were going through the items in her kitchen piece by piece, and she would describe the story of each item. Now, what you need to know about Julia, and there's a hilarious picture I found that's in the book of her with all of her kitchen gadgets, is that she was an obsessive kitchenware freak. There's a store in Paris called De Hillerin, where she probably bought half the store, especially all of their copperware and their knives and their spoons and whisks and so on. So she's on this video, which is, it's not really public, but it was a documenting of the items in her kitchen, and she's describing the Norwegian table they bought in Norway, and the Garland stove, which they bought in Washington for $400, and the copperware. But every once in a while, she'll poke her head up and say, you know, now what's happening in New York and in Washington and in Pennsylvania with those airplanes? And it's quite a moving thing to see. And so she gives the kitchen to the Smithsonian, and she moves west to Santa Barbara. Paul had died. Simca and her husband Jean had died. She had given up their little house in France called La Pichoune. And the New England winters were getting to be too much. And she was lonely in that big house. And she wanted to go back, I think, to her home base. And so when I was working with her on her memoir in 2004, she was at a very nice retirement community in Montecito, which is right next to Santa Barbara. And she every morning had breakfast with a group of ladies who she had gone to primary school with from Pasadena. Many of them had retired up there. Each one of them was a total character and full of opinions. And I thought of them as the feisty ladies breakfast club. And so it was a very comfortable place for her to be, and she loved it, and it reminded her of her childhood. And it was just an easy place. And she died on August 13th, 2004, which was 2 days shy of her 92nd birthday. Paul had lived to 92. And I said, Julia, you can make it, come on. And she said, okay, I'll do it. And I think she made it, 2 days, give or take. She died in her sleep of kidney failure. And we had people coming from all over the world to Santa Barbara to celebrate the birthday. And we decided to carry on. And so we had what turned into a 3-day wake with stories of Julia and Paul laughing and crying, and of course eating and drinking. And we all kind of looked at each other and said, well, of course Julia planned it this way, right? She went out as she led her life with great timing and style and a bit of mischievous humor. So Santa Barbara is, after Cambridge, I think of as her sort of spiritual resting place. The question is about Julia's idiosyncratic syntax. And we all have that voice in the back of our mind, or maybe we have the Dan Aykroyd version in the back of our mind. Very distinctive, kind of fluty, warbly, high-low voice. Very descriptive language. She would never say, you put a bowl down. She would say, you plop it down. And she was very demonstrative. She would demonstrate cuts of meat with her own body. She would show you. I can't answer that. People always ask that. Her siblings didn't have that voice particularly. It was just inherent to her. And at first, she was a little taken aback when people made fun of her voice. She didn't think there was anything funny with her voice at all. And it's hard to step out of yourself, even if you're Julia. But I think eventually she came to understand that she didn't speak like everybody and didn't write like everybody, and that was actually a bonus because it made her very distinctive. And I think it was part of her appeal. She worked on various levels, and that's why I read that bit from the end about Child's Play, because on the one hand, she was just naturally very funny and charismatic. And on the other hand, she had deep well of knowledge and really good technique, and she'd worked hard in obscurity for years, so she made it look easy. This voice of hers, it kind of cuts through the television into your brain. I gave a talk at the Boston Public Library yesterday, and a guy pulled me aside and said, that voice. I was with my girlfriend making out on the couch, and suddenly that voice came through, and we both stopped and stared at the television. There was just something about it. You had to listen to it. And I think that's right. That kind of sums it up. Well, it is amazing, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this second book, because the story we told in her memoir is that Julia didn't come to cooking till her late 30s, which in those days was considered ancient, right? You know, Paul and Julia never had children, and she said to me, you know, had I had children, I would have devoted myself to them. I wouldn't have had my career, and there was a sort of self-knowledge in that, and then, you know, so that was her first reinvention, her first act, if you will. And then when I started doing my research and I discovered this whole period in the 70s when she was in her 60s and reinvented herself again and again, it really struck me as admirable and inspiring. And I think you know, I didn't realize it when I was writing it, but there's now this thing in the media about second acts, that because of our economy, people being outplaced, or because of the fluidity of our society, you can now shift careers 2 or 3, 4 times. I think many people are confronting this dilemma of how do you reinvent yourself and move on. I think it's that aspect that has struck a chord for people with this new book, because, you know, she was 63 in 1975. That's a time when many people are contemplating their retirement and their golf game, and she was just getting started. She ramped it up. She got away from the French chef because she became Julia Child. She began to write in the first person. She began to use recipes from around the world, and she had even more success than she had in her first iteration, which is amazing. And that second act kind of carried her through to the very end. And she said, you know, I don't think I'll ever retire. You know, I just love what I do. I'm just going to keep doing it. You know, what would you even do in retirement? You know, she was a dynamo. And, you know, we don't all have her stamina, but we can all learn from her, overcoming these challenges, both personal and professional, and moving ahead. Great question, and this is one of the things that pains me, because we all write email now, and there's no letter writing, and we've lost the art of letter writing to a large degree. And the question is, where would someone like me turn for this kind of information? And I guess the only thing you can say is you would try to overturn every stone you could find. I mean, you know, old hard drives and printed out emails. People who received and sent emails, could you somehow access their archives? You know, when it comes to presidential history, this is an issue in Washington now, where they're actually preserving hard drives because everything's electronic. And you don't know how the day-to-day doings at the White House will be important, you know, 20, 30, 40 years from now. And so, like with those old French film clips that I watched at GBH, you know, they had one machine left that could play it. So, like, even if you preserve the hard drive, would you be able to access it? So you have to preserve a whole suite of technologies for that. And it's a great challenge for writers today. On the other hand, the internet and email adds a great ability to do research online. There are many documents online that in the old days I would have had to physically go digging through her papers to find, and I can, with a click of a mouse, I can find things, or I can see digitized clips. By the way, GBH is digitizing some of those French Chef in France documentaries, and I hope they get made public because they're fabulous. But so it's a win-lose calculation these days. Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, no, it's true. Julia was, despite all her hijinks, was very serious about gastronomy, and she noted how the French treated cooking as a combination of competitive sport and high art, and I think that's sort of how she thought of it. And she wanted us to think of food as more than something, more than just sustenance or fuel. Cooking is an art form and should be treated that way and studied that way, and we should have a depth of knowledge and understand the history so that we can go on and break the mold and do new things. And she would often say, if you're rooted in French technique, which she considered the best in the world, you can do any cuisine and just apply it to anything. And I think that's largely the way you guys teach here. And it's, the serious side of Julia, when you really look at it, is pretty profound. But she was canny enough to know that to reach a broad audience, you couldn't be all serious. You couldn't be like Jim Beard, for example. You had to have a wink and a grin and make it fun, make it sort of, and I don't mean that this is a demeaning way, but it's a sort of infotainment, right? As I was talking about, I think she would have mixed feelings about what she has wrought now with this crazy culinary media circus. But again, I think it has gotten more people talking about food than ever, and I think she would be thrilled by that. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. So the question is about essentially the chefs that Julia mentored or helped their careers move along. She did a series called Cooking with Master Chefs, or Cooking at Julia's, where she would invite master chefs to come over to her house here in Cambridge. Which is, you know what's interesting about that program? She had pitched that idea way back, like in the 60s. Why don't I get on with other chefs? And the GBH people weren't ready for that. They said, well, no one will be as good as you on TV, and it would be distracting for the audience. But she held on to that idea for years, and it was in the late 80s and early 90s that she did those series. And she got Emeril Lagasse on TV for the first time, and I actually interviewed him for this book. And he's the interesting guy because he's kind of the bridge figure between Julia's era of television cookery and the modern, craziness. He was a little crazy, but he grew up with Julia on the television in his family home. He's very eloquent about how she impacted him. And then there are people like Sarah Moulton, who now has a successful career as a cookbook writer and a television personality with her own shows on public television. Julia met Sarah here in Boston when she was doing Julia Child and More Company in 1979, and she desperately needed a food stylist, and Sarah Moulton lied and said, "Oh yes, I know how to do that." She didn't even know what a food stylist was, but that's okay. Through her friend Barrett Pratt, she was able to get on the show. She was a wonderful cook. She was very hardworking, and Julia kind of mentored her, and eventually sent her to a stage in France at a one-star restaurant where Sarah was harassed by the chef. And I will let you read the conclusion of that story, which is a pretty great story. Obviously, Jacques Pepin, another example of someone who Julia coached. She couldn't help him much in terms of his cooking. He had, after all, been the private chef for the President of France and had cooked at a 3-star restaurant in New York until he went to work for Howard Johnson's, I discovered, which is an amazing story. But she could teach him how to perform on television. And she said, lighten up, have some fun, it's TV, don't look so glum and serious, don't look like Jim Beard, look, smile, look into the camera. And he tells a funny story about his early days on TV when he would go across the country and he'd pull into a little town in, say, Oregon, and the TV station would be like 2 guys with 1 stationary camera, and the teleprompter was a guy sitting under the camera unrolling a large roll of paper towel onto which things had been scrawled. And he said those were the good old days of television, and he has since become a very adept television guy. And there are local heroes like Jasper White and Gordon Hammersley that Julia had on TV, and I think that really helped their careers. And Julia was resolutely non-commercial. She never endorsed products. She didn't endorse individual restaurants or chefs, but she was very generous with her love, if you will, and her She knew the power of her name. She would never talk about it, but clearly she understood the impact that she had. And she was willing to support people who were serious. And she would say, no flimsies. People often ask about Julie and Julia, where Nora Ephron made a big deal about Julie Powell and how Julia supposedly dissed Julie Powell, the young chef who was trying to do all of her recipes. And the reality is, Julia didn't really diss her. Julia was 91. She was working with me on her memoir. She was very busy. Her health was kind of waxing and waning. She didn't really know what a blog was. She'd never heard of Julie Powell. But I think the killer was that she had made her recipes kind of bulletproof. She worked in little asides where if something goes wrong when you're making the homemade mayonnaise, for example, she tells you how to save it. And so when Julie Powell complained that she couldn't do the recipe and that things were going wrong, I think Julia just was not interested and so didn't go out of her way to meet Julie Powell. It certainly wasn't personal. It just seemed inconsequential to her. But of course, Nora Ephron knew a good dramatic moment when she saw it and decided to expound on that. Anyway, the long story, that's a long way of saying that she was profoundly generous. You know, you'd go to a dinner party at her house and you'd be sitting next to a famous chef who had just been on television with her, and next to me on the other side would be a woman she had literally just met that day in the gas station and invited her over. And that was Julia, you know. Anyway, thank you all very much. Merci and bon appétit.